Have we been live this whole time? We are joined live this hour by Dr. Norma Cantu. We're really, very excited to be joined by her this hour. This is a real honor. This is one of the DAW signature series, our DAW speaker series. The DAW Center for the Arts is a not-for-profit based in Pomona, California, and we're an art gallery as well as an art lab. We try to service the community of Pomona and surrounding communities. And so now the world's on the internet, we service the world. So we're really excited to bring this to you today, a talk with Dr. Norma Cantu. This is really exciting. So Norma, we've had Luis Ure on. We talked about his upbringing in San Diego and how, going back to San Diego to TJ, how that really affected his world outlook and affected his writing. So I want to ask you a similar question. How did growing up in Texas, with the Mexican border right there, how did that kind of color your mind and the way you approached the topics you're going to write so beautifully about?
Well, primero que nada, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your project. I think it's an exciting project. Very happy you're doing it. Gracias. Y to answer your question, well, más que nada, I think there's three ways that growing up on the border aquí en Texas affected me or impacted who I am. One, as you can tell, I use Spanglish. I code switch, se me sale, because that's how we talk. And the other one is to have an ability to navigate different worlds because living on the border, I didn't know it at the time, but we really were navigating both the US and Mexico at the same time. Por ejemplo, I was, by the time I was learning how to do the metric system in school, I had already been doing it because we would go across and things were in kilos and you just learned it, litros, all of that. So I think for me, that was a very important one, the second one. And then the third, I think, has to do with a view or a perspective that I hope comes across in my writing, and that is that we are all the same. That regardless of where we go up or what we do or what we say, at the core, we're human beings who have a pretty generic makeup, not just biological, but also in terms of being human beings as a species. And I think that I learned because I grew up on the border by observing how the gringos and the Mexicanos and everybody else who came through Laredo, because not everybody stayed. When I was growing up, we had an Air Force base there in Laredo. And so we had people from all over the country come through. And everybody was different, obviously. But I also noticed that we were all human beings. And I think that kind of is a lesson that's there for me. And I'm sure there's other ways that I was impacted. I mean, the food I like to eat, I
Yeah,
like to go to the beach because we're not far from Corpus, stuff like that. Yeah.
yeah. So can you tell our audience you use the terms you said both Spanglish and code switch. So can you tell our audience a little bit about what is Spanglish and what is code switch, and how they may differ just a little bit?
Sure. I also use Tex-Mex.
This is a term that's new to me. I know Tex-Mex the cuisine. I did not know Tex-Mex the dialect, but in
Oh,
talking to Texans, I'm hearing more of this.
yeah. When we grew up, that's what it was. Nobody called it Spanglish then. And Tex-Mex had elements of Spanglish, but also elements of code switching. Code switching is when you switch from English to Spanish, but the two remain the same code. Por ejemplo, you use the Spanish there, and then I would go all into Spanish or all into English. When you use Spanglish, it's really a third space, a nepantla, if you will, a linguistic nepantla, where you have the elements of both codes coming together to create another one. And we grew up with that, diciendo typear, púchale el botón. So it's using a verb in English, like push, and conjugating it in Spanish, por ejemplo. Or using a word in English, but making it Spanish. So there's that constant moving of both languages to create a new one. And it's a very natural phenomenon. It doesn't just happen with Spanish and English on the border. It happens wherever there are two linguistic codes coming together. that a third kind of thing. That's why you get Chinglish, like Chinese and English, and others that get combined like that. But for us, it's the lingua franca. That's what we speak.
So it seems like so much of your entire career has been about people trying to categorize exactly what you're doing. Because they know it's good, but they don't know what it is, and they want to like put it somewhere on a shelf, and they're trying to understand it. So you were really one of the first people to really to write so prolifically in Spanglish. You're part of like kind of a generation of people that really kind of began that tradition. Um, when you first started doing that, was there a lot of people before the book even came out? Were there people trying to stop you or trying to like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, can you tell us that story or tell us about that? Sure.
Sure. Well, actually, my decision to even um, publish using that, because of course, growing up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, I was born in 47 and spoke only Spanish until I went to first grade in 54. It was pretty much one or the other. Even my family, my father was monolingual English, Spanish speaker and did not allow us to code switch or to bring in the English into the house. It was forbidden because he couldn't understand it. And I understand that. Of course, we still did. Among the siblings, we spoke English or Spanglish or whatever. But in my writing, it was really after Gloria and Sedua, well, maybe even before. I remember reading a poem once. I was in the library when I was getting my master's in Kingsville, and I just pulled out a book and I was kind of browsing through it. And by the way, that's one thing I miss about libraries nowadays. You can't just go in there and browse and draw from the shelf. Pretty much everything's controlled. So anyway, I pulled out this poetry book and I'm reading it. It was, I think, one of the Quinto Sol publications called El Grito, way back in the early 70s. And there it was, this poem about picking cotton. And it just floored me because that was my experience. We had been out there picking cotton. So, and it had words in Spanish, although the poem was in English. So that kind of was a revelation that my experience and my language would be part of literature. And I started, I had been writing poetry all along, but it was pretty much all Spanish or all English. And I started kind of experimenting with the sounds. I think poetry is about sound. And so I started putting it in and it worked. I liked it. And so when I approached the publishers with the manuscript, it had a lot more Spanish and they wanted me to translate it all into English. I resisted. They came back and said, well, we really want you to translate it to make it marketable. Obviously, they wanted a market, they want an audience that's going to buy the book in English. Lucky for me, Cormac McCarthy had just come out with a book and he had chunks of Spanish and they were not translated. So I used that argument with the press and they said, well, try your best to make it accessible. So I went back to the whole book and I did. I changed words here and there. So it was not translated one word next to the other, like many times you see, but in the context. The other thing was that it was not, like you're saying, it wasn't anything, they couldn't pigeonhole it because it had elements of autobiography. Obviously, it's about a little girl growing up on the border. It had photographs, which makes it more confusing. How can this be a novel? It has photographs. And I called the genre creative autobioethnography. I'm a folklorist. I've studied culture and folk life all my career. So the ethnographic part is in there. It's a very important part. And so I thought, why not put it all together? It's creative because it's fictionalized, some of it, but it is autobiographical and it is ethnographic. And so that's where that genre comes in. And you're right, people are always asking me, well, is it autobiography? Is it an ethnography? They want to pigeonhole it and put it in a little box. And I resist that. I don't like boxes and I don't like to be pigeonholed. So I think the work, like writing, kind of reflects that dislike for categorizing things.
Yeah. So what would you define for our audience who might not be so familiar? What does first before we add all those other prefixes and suffixes to it? What is ethnography?
Ah, it's the study of life. It's folk life. And for me, the ethnographic project is working and talking to people in their life and about the work they do. And it's not this, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not a scientific analysis necessarily, although there are some ethnographic scholars who do a very scientific analysis of the data that they collect. But I think it goes beyond that to the heart of being a human being, of being in a social system, in a society, and how we relate to each other. So, for example, if I'm working with Veronica Castillo, who is a ceramicist here in San Antonio, and she's giving a demonstration of how to cook mole. Well, that's, yeah, you could study it and analyze it from a scientific point of view. But my interest is more what are the stories behind it? Where did you learn to make the mole? Who taught you? Where does mole come from? Where does the word come from? And so it's a more of an, in a way, a more comprehensive analysis. And that's my definition. That's not necessarily the academic definition of ethnography, but that's how I approach it.
So then, how would one go about producing an creative autobiographical ethnography?
Uh, Life, again, focus on not just others people's lives, but your own. And that's the autobiographical part of it. I learned how to be a folklorist when I was 7 years old, and my grandmother was teaching me the names of all the yerbitas in her yard and what they were good for, all the tecitos. So, in a way, I was in training as a folklorist because I was curious. I wanted to learn. And then later I become the one who disseminates that information as a professor, right? So in a way, you become an autobioethnographer by positioning yourself within the ethnographic project. And there's others who have done similar things. Ruth Behar, as an anthropologist, talks about this. Even earlier, Levi Strauss, Claude Levi Strauss, a French anthropologist, also talked about his own involvement in the project, in the research. And so I think it's very difficult to keep. Let me give you an example. If I were a chemist and I was doing a chemistry research, it would be easier to distance the researcher from the subject. But even there, I believe that there's a reason why that chemist is researching that particular topic. And it may be in the subconscious, it may be an early childhood memory, who knows? But there is a connection to that person's life. Well, if I'm studying quinceañeras, I had a quinceañera. I know about quinceañeras. And so I'm doing the imic analysis from inside the whole endeavor. So a quinceañera is not just an object of study, it's something I live and that I value.
Yeah. So I mean, in reading a lot of your work or in encountering some of the stuff you do, everything is so seamless. It's kind of like life is lived, and there's again this struggle to categorize it. There's this idea to categorize it so that it can fit on a shelf within like the academic world, right? But what you just described, like okay, like it's not like you're a biochemist looking at some chemical element that you're obviously not a gaseous substance, right? So here, but you're talking about quinceañeras, and you yourself had a quinceañera. So um, I don't know what is it like? How do you? I'm really curious about what is it like to present this work to people who are sitting there like fascinating, like what is it like to present this work in an academic setting as opposed to just like in the community? Like how is it different when you're presenting
It
to the
hasn't
community?
been easy because, of course, well, in both worlds, in the creative writing world, my work isn't necessarily adhering to, for example, the narrative arc in a novel. So I'm already breaking some rules. Whereas in an academic American Folklore Society meeting, by the way, I'm the president this year, and I'm there presenting on Matachines Day. Well, my goal is not necessarily to just do an analysis, like I said earlier, like a scientist, but to talk about that and to make the scientific analysis accessible. So the Matachines and my analysis of that performance, that prayer dance, is embedded within a theoretical frame. Why is this happening? What is in the society that draws people to have hundreds and hundreds of years a tradition passed from one generation to the next of dancing El Dia de la Santa Cruz?
Mm.
And so to me, that that link, if you will, is it's different. And so people will want me to do a different kind of analysis. It's a little easier now, actually. When I started doing this back in the 70s and 80s, it was not very well accepted. But now, the because of people like Ruth Behar and others, the boundary has kind of become more fluid, and there's more room for people to be more interpretive in the analysis.
Yeah,
So things have changed, and I'm very glad about that.
yeah, no, that's great. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what a folklorist is?
Kind of what I was telling you, a folklorist studies life. Folklore is the lore, the knowledge of the folk, of people. So a folklorist, as I call myself, we look at that knowledge and value it, el conocimiento, la sabiduría of our people, of the people who have been dealing with this for generations. And like I said, passing it on from one generation to the next. And it is, I think, at the core of the humanistic analysis, the humanistic study. The humanities are at some level working from that folklore. And it transcends everything. I mean, even if you look at some of the classical musicians like Mozart, he drew from folklore to create the opera. And so it isn't necessarily, I mean, Shakespeare did too. He was drawing from the lore, the knowledge of the folk tales and the beliefs of the people to create art. And I think that's kind of the key. When you have art, whether it's narrative art or painting, that is rooted in the everyday life. That's folklore, the everyday life of a people.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work with the Folklore Society? Or
Yeah, the American Folklore Society has been around for over 100 years. 1890s, I think, is when it started. And I joined the group a long time ago. I was involved. My first academic paper, actually, when I was in graduate school, was at the Texas Folklore Society meeting in Kingsville, Texas. And I knew I was a folklorist. I just didn't claim it. I was in the closet because in the Department of English, it wasn't always favorably looked upon to be doing work like this. You know, you're supposed to read literature and analyze a poem and do a close reading of a novel, but not go out and collect fiestas and stuff. So it wasn't until 93, 90, well, actually 87 was the first time I worked with the Smithsonian at the American Folklife Festival in Washington. And I was doing work in Laredo with folklore groups, the Matachines and others, a piñata maker, que en paz descanse, el señor Catarino. And there were other things that I was doing because I'm interested and curious and I wanted to do it. But it was not counting towards my academic, tenure and all of that. But I was still doing it. And in 87, when I went to DC, it opened up all kinds of things. And then I went back in 92 for the festival. It was the anniversary of the American Folklore Society they were having. So I guess it started in 1892. They had me come in with one of the members of the Matachin group that I was working with to present. And then I got a job. Actually, I was borrowed from the university to go to the National Endowment for the Arts and work with the folk life and traditional program. And the folk life and traditional program was giving grant money to community groups who were doing things, mariachi groups and all kinds of things. And I learned a lot about that aspect of folklore, public sector folklore, they call it. It's not what you do in universities, it's what people do out in the community, cultural centers, things like that. So I think at that point, I was a member of the AFS, the American Folklore Society, and I saw myself again not being put in a little box because I was like an academic folklorist, but I was also a public sector folklorist, if you will, doing both things. And I got elected 2 years ago. Last year was you become president elect. This year I am president through next year, through January of next year. And it's really been, I don't know how to explain it. It's a coming full circle with my career, with what I can do for the society, for its members, as a bridge between the people like Veronica Castillo, who's working on her ceramic art, or the piñatero over here on Culebra Street, and this academic world and the public sector world of the people who are professional folklorists, if you will. So it's a very interesting place for me to be and also to do the work that I think matters. Gloria and Sedua said at one point, she writes, do work that matters. So it's always in the back of my mind, how is this, so what? How is this going to matter? And so I kind of go with that intuitively going there. And it's worked out really well. I'm very happy to be a folklorist, but also be an English professor, teaching creative writing, teaching literature, and writing. I love writing.
Well, no, that's incredible. I wanted to ask you though, in hearing this, were you one of the first like Chicanas to get involved in the folklore society, that particular organization, or are there a lot, or are we well represented within that organization?
Actually, not as well as I wish, but it is not bad. And we have some younger scholars that are in there doing wonderful folklore work. Rachel Gonzalez Martin, for example, at UT Austin, just had a book out on quinceañeras. There's lots of scholars doing wonderful work. And even earlier, the first, I guess he would call himself Hispano, who became a president of the American Folklore Society, was back in almost over 100 years ago. And so, no, we've been in there. Americo Paredes, for example, was involved also in the 60s, 70s to the 80s. And actually, all the way till he retired. We have a premio. The society has a premio named after Don Americo. Jose Limon got it last year. Jose is another folklorist. Many people don't call themselves folklorists. Alicia Gonzalez, for example, who was one of the first Chicanas to work at the Smithsonian doing this work, I don't think she ever used that to refer to herself, but that's the work we were doing. And Maria Herrera Sobek, a professor who has just recently retired from University of California, Santa Barbara, was one of the early ones that I remember being there when I joined in 95, 93, something like that. So yeah, they've been in there. We've been in there doing the work. And the other thing I tell you, I would rather be the one writing about my culture than an outsider coming in and doing it. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't mind. And if it weren't for scholars who came in and did the work, we wouldn't have that record. There's somebody, a Captain Burke in 1890s, doing folklore work in Laredo and in San Antonio, and looking at the Mexican community. And if it weren't for his work, we wouldn't have a record the way we do. We would have it in the oral tradition, but we have writings that he produced. And he also was a president of the American Folklore Society way back. So he was a military person, but he was also doing folklore. And to me, that also shows that you don't have to just do one thing; you can do several.
Yeah. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the publication of Canicula and how that kind of set the stage for?
Yeah,
Okay.
for Cabañuelas. Yeah, Canicula I wrote in the summer of 1993. It was published in 95 in the spring. And I didn't have great hopes. It was an exercise I had been doing with my classes of using photographs to elicit creative nonfiction. And it kind of took off on its own. I there's other interviews and other places where I talk about how that came to be because I really didn't set out to write that. I was writing the matachines. I was working on a book on matachines. But this nagging, well, you're a writer. You know how these things happen. You just, it's that espinita right in there trying to get you to go in that direction. And I finally succumbed and I said, okay, forget the matachines. And I just wrote this book. I was in Ana Castillo's home in Albuquerque that summer. It was the first summer where I wasn't teaching full time because in Laredo was a very small university. I had to teach summers. So for me, it was uh, a transformative experience on various levels because I had always been a professor who wrote. You know, you're a professor, you write a poem here and there, a short story. And all of a sudden, that publication made me a writer who teaches. And it was a shift. It wasn't easy. I had to kind of really think about it and accept and admit that it was important to me to also publish, not just to be a professor, but to also publish the creative work. And the poetry that had been there all along, since before high school, I think the poetry was what was keeping, it was the anchor that was keeping it steady all along. It still is. I still write poems all the time. But Canicula really changed that. It changed who not necessarily who I am, but how I am perceived. And I don't know how many people have read my dissertation. Not many, compared to how many people have read Canicula. Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned being a professor. Is there any way we could talk about a little bit about like your approach to teaching? Is your approach to teaching and your approach to writing? I mean, is there a lot of overlap or are there differences? Like how? What is your general approach? If someone wants to
Depends
take
on the
classes.
class. When I was teaching at Laredo, I was teaching everything because it was a small university, anything from American literature surveys to children's literature to linguistics, whatever needed to be taught. It was a teaching institution, so we were preparing elementary and high school teachers of English. So I taught differently. But I always had, and I still believe, like Bell Hooks does, that the classroom is a place when we can really make a difference and decolonize what we have inherited and change things as much as we can. I think now it's a lot easier because of social media. And although I'll tell you, teaching online this semester has been really difficult. I like the personal connection with my students. I like to have them come into my office and have conversations. Well, can't do it now. It has to be on Zoom. And it's not the same. The classes that I teach in creative writing are not your typical creative writing seminar where you do workshops and stuff like that. I do a lot of prompts. We do a lot of writing. Every week you have a piece due. And I give feedback, but we give each other feedback. And a lot of that is decolonizing and, in a way, implementing Ansalduan pedagogy. By the way, there's a book coming out called Teaching Ansaldua that two former students and I co-edited. We're going through the copy edits right now. And it's amazing how people approach use as and Sedua as an approach to teach, a pedagogical approach. But at the same time, also teach the concepts that come from Anzaldúa.
Yeah.
So that was a parenthesis.
Yeah.
But in my own class, I really try to honor the person in front of me. The student is not just a student, it's a human being. And I love to do conversational, we do group work and then we come together. I like to go on walks, field trips, if you will. And the semester, it would have been really amazing because I'm teaching an introduction to Chicanx folklore. And we would have gone out to Fiesta and interviewed people and done some field work. Couldn't do it. Had to kind of pivot and change everything. But we're doing some really interesting things. My students are writing wonderful papers on Selena and on quinceañeras and the political views of the quinceañera. I mean, things like that.
Yeah. Um, wow. So I'm actually, I had a question in mind, but now what you just said promotes the next question. So instead of interviewing people, do you have them like interviewing themselves, or how do you, or interviewing, how have you shifted?
Yeah, definitely. You have groups for one. You don't just interview one on one, although I've done that too. And you put people in conversation.
Mhm.
And I'm not calling them interviews, I'm calling them pláticas. Again, culturally based methodology that comes from our own comunidad. That's how we learn from each other. We have pláticas. I remember growing up, and even now, you go to Laredo, and there's people at the beauty shop, for example, and they're platicando, but they're teaching each other about, a recipe or doing things. Of course, a lot of chisme, but also the other. It's all in there.
Yeah. I mean, that's what, like what you described, your teaching methods are very, it's so similar to your writing, which is like, it's like kind of the stuff of life, right? And it's not, it, because the way we're so often taught is that there's the way we learn things, just generally speaking, outside of school, just the way we just learn information in the community, and then there's school, and it's very different. Like that's for that, and don't bring that in here, right? But you're actually just you're just the way you are there is the way you are here, and this is and we're just talking about it here versus there. It's really it's very seamless, organic. I don't know.
Yeah, and I do lecture. I mean, I do usually introduce a class with a short 15, 20-minute lecture to give background, to supplement the reading that students were doing, to expand on what was going on. But the rest of the class is kind of more Socratic. We engage in conversation. We have, some of it is structured, like in groups with particular questions. Often I will ask students to bring in questions and flip the classroom. So yeah, and I also believe, like Bell Hooks says, and like Paulo Freire, that education is to empower. It's to not, like he's saying, that the traditional one is, according to Freire, the traditional one is you're the receptacle and you're admitting all this knowledge from the professor. Uh, you don't need a professor to give you the knowledge. You gain that through reading, through life, through other things. I think the professor is there to facilitate and maybe encourage and maybe elucidate points that are not clear or that you're questioning, but not necessary to dispense knowledge. Knowledge is in every human being. We all have levels of knowledge. We all have, in a way, we bring to the classroom, all students bring to the classroom a lot of knowledge that we then can share and learn from.
So these are eventually designed for a wide cross section of the population. Not everyone who's familiar with, they don't all have the same frame of references and working points. So can you talk a little bit about Gloria and Sedua and why she's so significant?
Sure. Gloria and Sedua was a Chicana lesbian feminist who grew up on the border in South Texas, who was born in Hargill, Texas, I think in 1940, 42, 1940. And she wrote all kinds of books, but the one book that has kind of made her who she is, given her the platform. It's called Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza. When Borderlands was published in 1987, there weren't any other books like it. It's a hybrid text. That means it includes poetry, history, personal essay, testimonio, autohistoria, things that you normally would find in separate different books. She put them all together in this book. And it's a book, yes, about being queer, but more about being a soul in search of a home that is already there, but is kind of being becoming manifest. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to anyone. A lot of my students react negatively when they first read it. They think, why is she so angry? Well, I'm not even sure she was angry. I think she was speaking truth to power, that's for sure. And people then interpret it as anger. But she talks about language, she talks about the history of the border, she talks about the spiritual, which was anathema in academic circles. You don't talk about the spiritual or religious. And she brought it in. And so I think for those reasons, she was a pathbreaker. How people are using her work now is all over the place. I mean, in philosophy, in cultural anthropology, of course, in literature and in women's studies courses, she's there. But also places where you would not expect her to be. She passed away in 2004. She had diabetes, and it was complications of diabetes that killed her. She lived alone in Santa Cruz. She was working on her PhD. She had already pretty much written the dissertation, and so that one was published posthumously by Anna Louise Keating. It's called Luz en lo Oscuro, Light in the Dark, and it kind of brings all of it together. Borderlands was the first book. This one kind of encapsulates all of her philosophy and her theories.
So, we've talked about you as a writer, we've talked about you as a professor. You also are, we've talked about you as a folklorist and as president of the Folklorist Society. Can we talk a little bit about an organization that you were part of the co-founding of that many people, it means a lot to a lot of people, Candomundo. Can you
Oh
tell us
yeah.
how that came together and what it is?
Yeah, I love Cantomundo. Uh, what can I say? It was a dream. Several of us who were very active in Macondo. Macondo is the writers' workshop that Sandra Cisneros founded. And I love Macondo as well. It's a community of writers. It's not just Latinx writers, it's pre-mixed. It's not just poets, it's all genre. So the poets amongst us in Macondo, we're talking about maybe doing something, but it was not my idea. I have to confess. I was the promoter. I pushed it. I said yes, but I was not my idea to have an organization only for Latinx poets. Pablo Miguel Martinez, Celeste Guzmán, Deborah Paredes, Carmen Tafoya. We were the five co-founders at the very beginning. And we met in my kitchen over a meal, and we just talked and said, let's do this. Pablo and I had put out a call to several writers, poets that we thought would be interested in helping us get it off the ground. And those were the ones who responded. I really had wanted a couple of other poets that I knew would be very valuable to get the organization off the ground, but they were not available. So we did what we could. And that first Candomundo workshop was held in Albuquerque at the National Hispanic Heritage Center. They were amazing. They welcomed us. They gave us the space. We had the workshop. Demetria Martinez and who was a male and a female? I can remember. Martinez Pala were the teachers, and it was a wonderful experience. So the next year we came back to Texas, and we were doing it in Texas until I think 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when Deborah Paredes went to Colombia, and then went to Colombia for a couple of times. And now it's in Arizona. And of course, it's not going to happen this summer because of the pandemic. But the community is very strong. And you know, they hold regional readings, support each other. And it's a pretty intense workshop that happens at Candomundo, but that's only the summer workshop. It goes on all year. The people are involved. Right now, Juan Morales, one of the Cantomundistas, I was only there for the first 5 years. We kind of said, okay, how long can you give to the organization? I said, I can be here for 5, and then I have to step back. One thing that I have learned, Matt, is that when you start a group, especially something of this magnitude, it cannot rely on one person or two. It has to be invested. People have to invest in it to keep it going. And so my MO has always been to work with a group, to get it going, and then kind of recede and step back so others can come in and keep it going forward. And indeed, that's what's happened. It's really a beautiful thing that has happened. What else can I say? Oh, I was telling you about Juan Mireles, who's one of the Cantomundistas. He has a thing going right now about 30 poems in May. And so every day, people who signed up are writing poems every day and putting them in a folder that he created and on Google Docs. And so it's really, it keeps going. The point is that it isn't just coming to a workshop once a year. No, it's a lifelong commitment. If you're a Latinx poet, Candomundo means that it's there forever for you.
I know people take their roles as Canto Mundo fellows very very seriously, and they wear that. In the city of Los Angeles, I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it in different places too, but they wear it with a lot of pride, and
And
it
it's
means a lot.
also very competitive to get in. And the only criteria is the work. We, uh, all of the things you may have heard, people have told me this, that they think it's cliquish, that it's people who you know and all this. No, I can attest to it. It's the work. The work you submit is evaluated against everybody else who submitted. So if it's a really bad year, meaning that all the poets are good, you're going to have a hard time getting in.
Yeah.
Other years, it may not be as competitive because you don't have as many strong applications. But we've been getting, I don't know what it is these days, but we were getting, I don't know, say 100 applications, and we could only accept 10. So it's very competitive.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So you talk about the way that you were involved with Quantum Mundo heavily in the beginning. We kind of like had an exit plan. So that speaks a lot to kind of this concept of like mentorship. So what are your philosophies around mentorship? Like how do you mentor somebody to just this is gonna live beyond me or
That's
live beyond my involvement anyways?
yeah, no one's asked me about that. That's a good question. I My first instinct is to be the mentor I wish I had had, and that is somebody who's supportive, guide, gives me guidance, doesn't tell me what to do. Nobody knows what somebody else should do, but you can offer options, give perspective. I've been a mentor on AWP, for example, a couple of times, and that has been very useful for, I think, for the people going through it, the mentees, but also for me to kind of give back to that organization and to help young writers who are coming into writing to kind of learn the ropes because nobody was there for me to do that. And so I want to do that for those who come after me. In the academic sense, the mentorship takes on a different role. It's more about, for example, telling a student, do you want to be a professional writer? Do you want to write? Because often they're in my creative writing class and nobody, especially the Chicanas students, nobody has told them that they could do that or given them permissions to dream, to imagine that they could be a writer. Um, To me, no one was there to tell me. I could have been publishing way earlier. Canicula came out when I was 45. So it could have been happening way before, but nobody was there kind of mentoring and saying, you can do this. And I'm sure you've heard about the imposter syndrome, especially for Chicanas and actually people of color. There's this sense that maybe we don't belong. I mean, definitely the New York publishers have been acknowledging that we belong. So there's this sense, this message that gets embedded into our being or into our psyche that maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Who am I to think I'm a writer? How can anybody want to read my Spanglish? And so that creates, in my view, a deficiency, a way of looking at yourself as being deficient. On the other hand, it should be an asset. So if anything, when I mentor, I make sure that my mentees, and some of them are not even called that, they're just relationships you develop with people.
Yeah.
I don't particularly like that word. You just kind of, for example, if I see that there's a contest coming through or a call for papers on La Llorona,
Mhm.
it's folklore, but it's also poetic and everything else. So I'll put it out and send it to particular people that I think might want to contribute. In a way, that's mentoring.
Yeah, I suppose it's just it's. I mean, like this entire conversation has been uh, almost one around the question of labels, right? Because in the rejection of labels, right? So I guess it's really just a question of passing down experience, right? Like just I've done something. Here's how you do it. Like
Yeah, y platicando.
platicando. So we actually have a question from the audience, and Elvia Rubalcava. I always mess up her name. I know her. What do you think people will be studying during this pandemic time? What do you, man, computer here. What do you think people will be studying in this pandemic time in regards to folklore?
Oh, we're already collecting a lot of material. Folklore is our hard at work documenting what's going on. I've seen pieces already written, for example, on chain letters. Have you been getting those?
Yeah,
All chain letters on social media. There was a really good piece come out of the Smithsonian website, a blog that talks about how the what we're experiencing is going to create folklore. People, all the urban legends that are out there, conspiracy theories, all of that is the material of folklore. So definitely, yeah, we're going to see a lot, and we're also going to see more creative writing. Definitely poetry. I've seen a lot of poetry already coming out of this. Whenever you have a disruption in the same old way of doing things, it's going to create openings for new things to come through. What you're doing with this, with the interviews, I think is one way. You are documenting people's lives during the pandemic and getting an opportunity to talk about their work. I think that's part of the way we're going to shift, if you will. It's an opening for doing things differently, for doing things, I'm not going to say better, but in a different manner.
Well, when I started doing this, I wanted to make a real point of it that unless somebody really wanted to talk about the pandemic, that I wasn't going to focus on the pandemic. I was going to focus on their work. I mean, before we started before we went live, I was saying that right now I got a captive. It's not so much a captive audience, but a captive interview base. um,
It's a very smart and very wise thing to do. There is a need, probably a place for focusing on the pandemic, but I think the forum that you're offering for writers and all kinds of people who come to this is to talk about other than the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic is going to come in. It's in all of our minds. It's right there. But that should not be, in my view, at this point, the focus. We have larger ideas and we have other things that we're dealing with as well as that.
yeah, we got a lot of life in us. So I really appreciate this.
Yeah,
We're coming up on the
a lot of
hour.
folk
We've
life.
been speaking for an hour now, almost. It's gone by so quickly. Is there where can we're gonna drop the links below, but where can people find your work? Where can they connect to your newest projects? what should people know about what's going on right now in the world of Norma Cantu?
Uh, Last year in 19, I published a novel. That's the one that follows Canicula. It's called Cabañuela, and it's University of New Mexico Press. Find it anywhere. I have it right here. Oops. And I also published a collection of poetry called Meditación Fronteriza. That one was out of the University of Arizona Press, also available. The poems are in English, although the title is in Spanish. There are some poems in Spanish, lots in Spanglish, some translations. That's right now. And right now, I'm working on another novel that I hope to finish this summer called Champu, spelled in the Spanish, Champu with an accent on the U, Champu, or Hair Matters. And it takes place, I've been working on it for a few years now. You pick it up and you leave it and you pick it up again. I'm definitely going to finish it this summer. It's set in Laredo, Texas, again, and it's about a beauty shop. Diamond, Diamantina, she goes by Diamond, is kind of the protagonist, but really it's a collage of stories, some of them true, again, bending with the whole thing, some of them creative. It's creative autobiography plus, because I'm pushing it to other areas. And it's all centered around the beauty shop, but it really is about the community of Laredo, Texas during the George Washington's birthday celebration.
I would absolutely be remiss if because the first I ever heard of it was on Latino USA, on Maria Hinojosa's show, when she was talking about the celebration of George Washington's birthday, and I was not going to bring it up, but you brought it up. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, as a folklorist, how could I not? It's my community's big fiesta. I study fiestas. I
Yeah.
have not published articles on it. I have not done the field work, if you will, but I've lived it. And so it's in Canicula, it's in Cabañuelas, and it's definitely going to be in Champu. In Champu, it's almost like a parody of some of the things that are going on. There's a menudo cook-off, and it's rigged. So the stuff that happens in the community, the gay bashing,
Mm.
the murders, not too much about the contemporary, although it's in there, but not too much. The cartel and the violence on the border, um, that's in there. The Salvadorian immigrants that came in the 80s and stayed, we have some of that. It's a real collage that overall gives you a picture of this community in the late 20th, early 21st century.
Yeah. It sounds like fantastic work. So, you've done so much incredible work. You're doing so much incredible work. You have so much incredible work on the horizon. It's been a real honor and pleasure to speak with you. Is there any advice you have for young writers who feel like they can't that they have to somehow translate their lived experience into like, now this is writing, like, because you've shown such a great example of not having to do that. Can you give some words of encouragement and courage, like, to be themselves? I mean,
I guess the only piece of advice is to listen to your heart, to work from your truth, and the writing will come. It's amazing when I hear people say they have writer's block. I have never had that. I cannot be very empathetic. Maybe it was such writing for me, such a comfort and a thirst from anything that is happening that I don't see that. I mean, if I and I do this, I'm writing a poem, but then I'm also writing a little bit of a novel, and I'm also reading. The other piece of advice is to read widely. I just finished Uriah's House of Broken Angels, beautiful book, really well written, structurally and otherwise. Um, in a way, I'm sure he's in there. In fact, at the end, he talks about he had an older brother that he modeled the character on. So just listen to your heart. That's the biggest thing, and work from that place where your truth resides. And we can lie to ourselves. I don't say we don't. But when you're writing, if you really go there, you're not lying. You're speaking truth to power, and it's your truth and it's your power. And it's very powerful on a personal level to confront that, to go there. And also, when I'm writing and I start crying, I know I'm there. That's where I need to be. Or when I'm writing and I start laughing, I know that's the right place to be. So I think the emotions elicited through the writing, both for the writer and for the reader, are what connects us as human beings.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Norma Cantu. This has been a production of the Dallas Center for the Arts. Dallas Center for the Arts is a not-for-profit based in Pomona, California, and we could not have been more honored than to have been joined this hour by the great Norma Cantu. Thank you so much.
Gracias.